Okay, so yes, I've got every buzzword in the title of my presentation. That's to keep you here, because of course I'm the last speaker of the day. You'll be glad to know I don't have any video in my presentation, so that will save us all a bit of embarrassment. Now, what's been interesting over the last 24 hours since I've been here, connecting with the local blockchain community, is understanding that crypto is a bit of a dirty word in Lithuania because of the whole ICO phenomena. Actually, much more so than many other countries that I visit. So what I want to try to do is to throw a line to the blockchain community here and give some context as to why, yes, crypto assets and ICOs have been an important way of crowdfunding projects, but looking into the future, more importantly, their role that they can play within real-world business context. So as you can probably gather from this kind of mix of technologies, the main thing that I want to talk about is this assumption that crypto is predominantly for people. And whilst it might serve people, my argument is crypto might mainly be for machines. So I always like to get this on a screen behind me just to really bring home the importance of crypto. So you'll probably recognize the association of this to Amazon. And if we kind of have some context, if we think about the internet as it is today, for the last 20 years, the internet has been dominated by two things. The platform model, so mediated marketplaces, and the cloud, this kind of distributed form of computing that allows that platform to scale and become near ubiquitous. And of course, this has delivered huge convenience for all of us. And its success has made a handful of people very rich, and it's led to a number of platform monopolies, claiming increasing dominion over human experience. So, you know, if we think about what's at the heart of the platform model that's inherent to the web, is something that's recently been called surveillance capitalism. And if you haven't read the book, I would highly recommend it. It's about that thick. But effectively, it talks about the business model of Google and how that's become the default business model for the web. And at the heart of that is the idea of behavioral modification through proprietary algorithm. And that didn't feel that serious when it was just giving us annoying ads. But now we're looking at innovations in AR and spatial computing where we have hardware attached to our bodies, collecting biometric data, watching our body's response to content. These kind of platform monopolies, this surveillance capitalism, will get to know us better than we know ourselves. You can't get more intrusive than inside you. And that's the objective of surveillance capitalism. That's the objective of the platform co-op. Now, what's interesting is on the left side, you can see this paradigm broken out in terms of authority and access and how it treats data. And on the right, we have something that I've labeled Decentralized Web. This is actually from one of our portfolio. I'm an investor called Higher Networks, and this is how they define the difference between Web 2 and Web 3. And you can call this Web 3, you can call it the Decentralized Web. But the premise is that at the heart of this, there is this bottom-up emergent stack of technologies that promise to unbundle these platforms and to decentralize this cloud architecture that allows it to have an unfair advantage in how it scales. And the thing is, a lot of governments, you know, this surveillance capitalism serves the US in a certain way, and we're kind of seeing this with the trade war that's breaking out at the moment, this fight between Huawei and the equivalents in the US. You have, at a certain scale, centralized technology companies become an extension of the state. It's impossible for them to not become an extension of the state. And so you could argue most of the things that have come out of Silicon Valley serve as an extension for US interests, and what's coming out of China serve slightly different interests. One, surveillance capitalism, the other one you could call digital statism. But ultimately, they serve the interests of the platform, and the platform's given permissions that allow it to do things with data that it wouldn't ordinarily be allowed to do. And actually, in Europe, we're kind of somewhere in the middle. We have a choice between surveillance capitalism from the West, or we have the choice of digital statism from the East. And I would propose, actually, that there's a third way, and that third way, I think, has a really big opportunity here within Europe, and for a number of reasons. Europe is probably the only environment where the government is actively trying to constrain platform monopolies. They're trying to put in place things like GDPR that protect and respect citizen data. They're having the right to be forgotten. So there's this top-down will and intention to kind of try to deconstruct these monopolies. But that's not the subject of my talk. That's just some context. The subject of my talk is what's happening from the bottom up. And from the bottom up, we have this new emergent set of internet protocols that are open source and increasingly decentralized. And what that means is that rather than serve the interests of a platform, of a particular commercial interest, they look to disintermediate that and serve the interests of the end user. And so the interests of the end user is what's at the heart of this, and you would call that self-sovereignty. It's the self-sovereignty of the individual and the user and their data. And so we've been investing broadly in the blockchain space for about 5 years. And about 3 years ago, we began to define what we saw as this emerging technology stack, going all the way from the hardware layer and IoT data collection, all the way up to the AI layer. And what's important here is when most people think of DLT or blockchain, they think about it almost in isolation. But actually, the promise and potential of a blockchain or a distributed ledger is that it can enable a new data economy, a new data paradigm. And that new data paradigm can actually solve many of the problems that IoT has at scale around data provenance and whether you can trust the data that comes into the system, as well as the security of that system in the current cloud construct, all the way up to how you solve the problem of enabling AI companies to access more data and effectively gain an equal footing to compete with the Googles of this world, which is an almost impossible job. And so the promise of this technology stack, as we've observed and tracked the space, is that it promises to unbundle these platform monopolies and distribute value away from a handful of platforms to a network, and increasingly distribute the compute power away from the cloud model, again, back out to the network. Now, coming back to the first kind of concept that I seeded at the beginning of the talk, when people think of crypto, they largely think of it in the context of a digital money, and a digital money that people will willingly and knowingly adopt. So the idea that people will go into a bar and pay for a beer with a Bitcoin. And whilst that might be true, and of course, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, to one extent, perform some of the functions of money, the reality, as we've seen, is that people still aren't out there buying coffees with Bitcoin, but excluding a handful of places. So what I propose is, actually, if you think about this emergent technology stack that I mentioned, and you think about it in the context of enabling us to connect IoT devices, to feed data into a system that doesn't have to go through one centralized platform. If we think about it in the context of unlocking data silos to allow anybody to train AI algorithms, really, we're not talking so much about people. And if you think about the internet as it is today, there are more devices connected to the internet than people already. And half of all web traffic is from bots. And half of that is from malicious bots, so malicious activity. So if you think about most of the economic activity that's happening on the internet today, it's not people. Or it's increasingly less about people. And so what I propose is that this new emergent technology stack in the Web3 context is as much about how people interact with devices or bots and how they might interact with one another, which you might call the machine-to-machine economy, that is most interesting. And so when you think about the internet and its population in that context, you know, the reality is that unlike people, machines can be logical. They can be rational, at least in theory. And if you ask any economist, the problem with people when they're trying to design for new systems is they never bloody do what you want them to do, right? They're illogical, they're irrational, they're messy. But the interesting thing is, if we're designing an internet primarily not just for people, but increasingly for machines that can be logical, then actually they can respond better to incentives and disincentives and rules. And so actually there's the potential that were we able to imbue this internet, these new protocols, with rules, with incentives and disincentives, then we could devolve trust to the logic of the network, not a handful of platforms. And so this promises to enable a rules-based web. And again, if you remember what I was saying about half of all web traffic is from bots and half of that is malicious bots, that's because there is no cost to their bad activity at scale. Very deliberately, the internet was designed with free market fundamentalism at its heart. That was core to Tim Berners-Lee's vision of the web. And the consequence is we've left open these evolutionary niches that have been populated by platforms. And they then monopolize the mediation of exchange of value between us as people. And therefore, it's not truly peer-to-peer. Whilst here we're talking about truly peer-to-peer environments, but also in the context of machines. And therefore, here we have the opportunity to, for the first time ever, have a rules-based web. And normally when you say we can have a rules-based web, everybody has a heart attack. Well, wait a minute, you can't impose rules on the web. Who decides those rules? Well, the really interesting thing about this new set of protocols is that they're generally open source. And so what that means is that it isn't one set of rules. It's that anybody can imbue a system with a set of rules. And the rules that produce the most order will be where the most economic activity happens. So it's a massive experiment in socioeconomics to create systems whereby we can have rules where there can be a cost to malicious behavior, but more importantly, an incentive for positive behavior. And so at the heart of this, I'm kind of teasing you towards what is the core of the innovation of crypto, which again has this really negative connotation. But at the heart of crypto is digital scarcity. And what I mean by that is Bitcoin was the first instance of something that was both digital and scarce, in that it could be digital and it couldn't be copied. And if you think about anything else that went near the internet, like an MP3 file, a movie file, a sound file, it got copied innumerable times. It lost almost all value. And so this innovation came along, and all of a sudden we could have a thing, an asset that lived on the internet, native to the internet, that could be shared, but that couldn't be copied. And the really interesting thing about that is because it's digital, it's programmable. So now we have these digital assets. They can be unique, but they can also be programmable. They can be programmed with rules, with incentives and disincentives. And so actually, I propose that the success of crypto is predicated on our ability to effectively design for game theory and game theoretics into these systems, to create the incentives that encourage people to bootstrap a network, but also their ongoing coordination. So good actors are incentivized to participate. And if we think about, again, the innovation of Bitcoin, it plays out a very particular game that it wants miners to play to secure a network. And ultimately, it is optimizing for network security in as decentralized way as possible. It is not trying to optimize for anything else. And that's why it consumes a lot of energy. It's very costly to perform transactions because you can't do all things at once. You can't be cheap, fast, and secure. You have to make a trade-off. And so it's made certain trade-offs. But again, the reality is that these things are open source. So anybody can take this set of technologies, they can configure it to whatever trade-offs that they want to make to optimize for whatever inefficiency or kind of optimization function they want to see in the network. So literally any of these things here could and are being optimized for. There are specific protocols with specific tokens that are optimizing people to secure these things in a distributed or decentralized way, so with no central coordination. And again, if you think, well, that sounds like sci-fi, it's never going to happen, remember what happened with Bitcoin. It created one simple game. It didn't ask anybody's permission. And it got to the point where it's mobilized billions of dollars of capital, both stored in it as a store of value, but also we've now got to the point where hardware has been optimized to shipping containers worth $1 million each, water-cooled rig, a mining rig, that can be plugged into any cheap or abundant energy source in the world, from Costa Rica to Iceland. That happened on its own, because the rules of the game allowed for that optimization function. And so the limitations of this are really down to your creativity. Now, the idea is that this can unlock trillions of dollars of inefficiencies in the world. The world that we live in is highly suboptimal. If you think about the amount of assets that we only partially use, from our bandwidth, our mobile credits, our computer storage, and whatever it may be, our compute power, our dormant compute power, our energy in an energy grid. So coming back to the convergence point, the idea that we're seeing these technologies converge of IoT, big data, AI, powered by distributed ledger technology or blockchains, where the digital asset, the crypto, is the digital commodity. So if you think of these things as supply chains and value chains, this programmable asset is now the commodity that fuels this digital economy. Now, we've now evolved this from this rather crude image I showed you earlier, which was kind of a conceptual way that IoT and DLT and AI would begin to combine, into a literal technology stack. And we've incubated and tracked and invested in many of these. And some of these that are listed under each of these categories are specific investments that we've made. But actually, it's a whole ecosystem of technologies, almost all of them open source, almost all of them either totally or partially permissioned, i.e. anybody can participate in the value creation of these digital economies. And we call this the Convergence Stack. And the reason why this is really important to think of it as a technology stack and see it in this context is in the blockchain world, we have this awful habit of creating a vernacular that makes sense only to us. So we'll say, well, we have layer 1 and we have layer 2. It means absolutely nothing to the average developer. And if you think about what this is a toolkit for developers to realize a new web, and therefore it needs to make sense to them. And so we've placed this within an OSI-like framework that goes all the way from hardware up to the application layer. And that's affected how we, as an investor, think of ourselves. So we've also, rather than thinking about the things we invest in as a portfolio, we've now begun to think of them as a stack, and therefore our model is venture as a stack. We are investing in a group of highly synergistic technologies that together promise a third way to create a new web. And so we've oriented our entire platform around that. We've got 30+ people, and we're committing about $30 million of our own money to support these protocols that we've been investing in. So not companies, not startups, but open source protocols. And the only reason why we can do that is because of these digital assets. For the first time ever, crypto has given open source a business model that can outcompete the classic startup venture model, that allows anybody that participates in the creation or bootstrapping of these networks to become a shareholder in those networks, and to have a liquidity, a secondary market, where if they want to move into another network, they can effectively sell their stake and their share of these digital commodities, these tokens that have been issued in this network. And so actually, our business model now as an advisor is, how do you design for both the realization of a distributed network, but then also the diffusion of that innovation? How do you get developers to begin to use it? So the reason why I'm traveling around the Baltics is because, again, if you think about what's required to make this happen, the toolkit's here. You now have this set of technologies. You have the toolkit that can enable you to design for new digital economies or participate in them. But ultimately, it means nothing if developers aren't aware that there is an alternative. So most developers, most CTOs, and most startups are still designing businesses in the old paradigm of a platform model. How can I create a platform that captures value, which I can potentially try to create a monopoly in? And actually, they should be thinking of how can I either create a network that can distribute value equitably, not equally, but equitably amongst participants, or how can I build a business on top that's going to add value to that? And so I'm evangelizing to where there are rich and deep developer ecosystems, not necessarily in blockchain, but more broadly, in order that we can manifest and accelerate this future more quickly. Because the alternative that we're left with is not just antisocial, ironically, given these are social media platforms and what have you, but it's ultimately unsustainable. The level of encroachment on our personal lives and data is unsustainable, and it's killing competition. Startups, almost every startup nowadays is going to have to be a machine learning AI startup, and it's almost impossible for them to compete with Google because they don't have the data. And so by unbundling these platforms and creating a new data economy, we have a small window of opportunity to challenge the status quo. So that's my presentation. I think I've probably got time for questions. And if you are a developer, either within an enterprise or within a startup, I beg you to start thinking about this new paradigm rather than reinforcing the old one.
Thank you, Jamie, for your brilliant presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions?
Great.
Okay, well, that's all clear. Perhaps and that fits well into the context of this all-over conference. We're really looking at shaping the future in the next 10 years. So where do you personally stand in 10 years' time from now with your venture?
Yeah, well, and that's the interesting question. So all of these things that I discussed, we are looking in a 10-year cycle. I mean, Bitcoin is 10 years old, and that is the first instance of this kind of innovation. And so a lot of the things that I just mentioned are in their infancy. We are still building out this infrastructure. And I think the big problem and the reason why we had this problem with crypto originally was everybody conceptually thought, well, we can do all of this stuff. Because, of course, it makes sense. Once you think of a decentralized web, you think of all the things you can decentralize. And people rushed to try to realize those businesses. But the reality was the infrastructure wasn't there. And so people raised loads of money and realized they couldn't build all these things on Ethereum or what have you. And so there was great disappointment, and this is quite normal with most technology innovations. You have this kind of trough of disillusionment. We're almost definitely in that right now. But the infrastructure is being built. And I would say within the next 5 years, we're going to start to see truly decentralized business models emerge that could compete in a usability experience with the average platform.
Thank you. What you also mentioned on your last slide, join the stack. What kind of people do you need?
So it's at two ends. You know, if you go to our website, you'll see that kind of stack that I showed earlier. And we've probably only found projects within maybe 8 categories that are out there that are attempting to realize that particular problem, solve for that particular problem. At least half of the stack has no serious participant, and we know that without some of these fundamental things solved, the stack just won't work. So if you can go and have a look at that stack, and if you're working on something that you think speak to that, please get in touch. We'd love to figure out how we can support you. And then equally, if you're a startup and you're thinking about creating a new startup, again, get in touch, because we can introduce you to this new technology set that can enable you to create a future-proofed business. And I think that's what's most important, because the problem is VCs today will still give you money for the old paradigm, because that's what they operate in.
Exactly. Okay, Jamie, thank you so much once again for your presentation. Thanks. And the best of luck with your future endeavors.